Hi all, I'm Saranya, founder of the Bombay Poetry Crawl, and in this month's episode, I had the privilege of interviewing Dr. Rakhshanda Jalil, a writer, translator, academic, critic, literary historian, and excellent researcher. Dr. Jalil's writings on the Urdu prose and poetry writers of India has been so fundamental to the Bombay Poetry Crawl. Her book, Liking Progress, Loving Change, a literary history of the PWA in India is so expansive and so cohesive, and it deals with all of Urdu literature's histories pre, post, independence, through partition, through political and social changes. She's written about poets like Dr. Rashid Jahan and Shahryar, and most recently she's translated Gulzar's poetry. It's been such an incredible time that I had talking with her. I'm really excited for all of you to listen to this conversation and get as enlightened by it as I was. But yeah, Dr. Jalil, thank you so much for speaking with me. Your research has been so crucial to my own work. So I'm very, very grateful that I actually get to speak with you today. So first, I want to thank you for the incredible work that you've done. And I have access to your work mostly through your writings on the heritage of Urdu literature in India. So I want to ask, where did this interest come from, and when did your research begin? How did it begin, and what is the trajectory it took?
Okay, so the Progressives book, Saranya, that you are referring to is actually my PhD work, which I did in my mid 40s. I had two children, a home, a husband, various social and other responsibilities, and I did something incredibly selfish. I took time out. I kind of took a year's leave without pay from my job. I did whatever travel that was required for this book. And for the last 6 months of the actual writing of the thesis, I rented this little cubicle, the size of a grave with Wi Fi, in the India International Center Library. And I sort of sealed myself in that. I would come in the morning, I'd work till 8 and then go home and then come again the next day. And this is with children and all of the rest that was also somehow taking care of itself. And I'm a great believer in studying late in life. There was a 20-year gap between my master's in English and this PhD. And I thought I'd lost my moho, would I ever be able to do academic writing and, cross references and all of that? Because I had been writing. It's not like I had a fallow period with no writing at all, but they were not academic. They were translations or other things. So in my 40s, when I sit down to write this thesis on the progressive writers movement, a kind of a literary history, and I want to say this to any young people who might be listening to this: no reading ever goes waste. Yeah, no form of education. It could be self-taught, it could be classroom education, it could be formal, it could be informal, it could be anything. It actually doesn't go waste. The human mind stores it, and it surprises you at the manner in which it stores information, random bits of information. And in my case, all these translations that I'd been doing, they were leading me organically towards the progressive movement, because quite without knowing it or without articulating it, I knew I was interested in socially engaged, socially purposive literature, progressive literature as we understand it, where literature holds up a mirror to society, and in that mirror you see the world and you see the good, the bad, the ugly, and the writer thinks it's his job to hold up a mirror to the world, right? So those were the writers who'd been interesting me for a very long time. Those are the writers I'd been translating. And it took me a very long time to understand that I was actually moving towards something which I couldn't articulate and fully understand. And I'd come from this formal education, a BA in English literature, then a master's in English literature, which in my time was very Anglo-Saxon. So I knew a great deal of Wordsworth and Keats and all the rest of it. But whatever little I knew of Urdu poetry was self-taught, which I'd picked up in my home, which is an Urdu-speaking household. Fragments of poetry that I'd heard recited in the family, and they stayed somewhere. And by then I'd learned to read and write fairly fluently in Urdu. So I had Urdu with me. But no formal education in Urdu. My education was very Anglo-Saxon. You see,
Hmm.
my frame of reference, my critical idiom, my ability to make literary references was what a master's in English person has. So there was a lot of unlearning and relearning or learning new things. And I'd never read Urdu criticism. So for this master's, I read all of that. And I must say that there's a lot to be said for what you teach yourself or what you learn to study on your own. And this hurry that we are in, this hurry that we are conditioned to be in, that you do all your education back to back, cut, your
Yeah.
BA, your MA, and your MPhil, and your PhD. There's no earthly need actually for that. And I think this book that you held up before we started this conversation, I think it was, if I may say so myself, at the risk of sounding immodest, I think it was richer simply because by then I'd read a great deal. Had I done it in my 20s, which is the age when you do your PhD,
Yeah.
I think it would have been a very flat narrative. I think I was able to draw in things because by then in my 40s I'd read a great deal.
Absolutely. I mean, just to hear a woman saying that, she put herself first and what she wanted to do
Yes,
first before her family is
yeah,
so inspiring, and also which also makes me say you should not call yourself immodest, like like immodest. You should talk about your work in very factual ways, which is that it's a very expansive book that deals with so many different worlds of Urdu literature. Poetry,
yeah.
prose, politics, pre-independence, partition, post-independence, women writers. It's such a coherent book, and I'm very grateful for you to write it.
Can I
And
just interrupt you for a second? You see, again, this was not a conventional product of an English literature background because it was between Urdu and English, but also my supervisor was a historian, so he made me understand the importance of primary sources. My first draft, he kind of threw in my face and said that, show me your primary sources. And as students of literature, we think our text is our primary source. But for a historian, your primary sources are archival sources, even interviews. He was willing to give importance even to oral testimonies. So
yeah.
he said, how many hours have you spent in the archives? I said, why would I want to go to the archives? And so after that first draft was literally thrown in my face and I reworked that thesis, I spent about a month in the British Library going through the India Office Records, IOR. The India Office Records are housed in the British Library, and there were these khufia police. There were these people whose job was to pretend to be writers and to sit in on the progressive writers meetings. Yeah,
Oh,
the
wow.
walk that you lead, Saranya. Can you imagine that in this midst of these bona fide writers, there are these bogus writers who are just pretending to be writers? Why? Because their job is to make copious notes of everything that is being said and done, who's coming, who's going, who attends regularly, who does not attend regularly, and then give these notes to his or her immediate supervisor, who's somebody in the khufia police, the secret police.
Wow.
And then there was a whole system in place in this colonial administration. And looking at those files, I was able to see markings in different colors, ink by different colors, hands, that at every rung of the bureaucracy, somebody is taking note. So, writers were being given importance because they were considered public intellectuals. They were considered people who have their pulse to the public sentiment. And also remember that, rightly or wrongly, a great many of the progressive writers were considered to be leftists, to be considered communists. They were, in some instances, yes, members of the Communist Party, but great many were sympathizers. Others were what I like to call fellow travelers, but all were not communists. But for the colonial administration, the Progressive Writers Association was something to be feared and to be watched and to keep a very close eye. And hence this scrutiny, hence this secret police that would keep notes. So when I was going through the records in the British Library in London, I was able to see the various rungs of that administration, the notes that they were making, and how watchful they were of the activities of this otherwise ostensibly literary grouping. I'm
Yeah.
sorry I interrupted you. You were saying something.
No, but that actually leads me to my question, which I mean, this is so interesting because what I'm seeing right now, apart from in depth research books, is there's a lot of reductive writing about the progressives and a lot of reductive writing about Urdu literature, partly also perhaps because there's such an oppression against Urdu in the current political atmosphere. But for our listeners who don't know, can you talk a little bit about what was the All India Progressive Writers Association, the Anjuman Tarakki Pasand Munafin Hind?
Musannifin. Writers. Musannifin is the plural
Sanfi.
of writers. Writers. So, in April 1936, the first All India Progressive Writers Association meets in a modest hall called Rifai Aam Hall in Lucknow, and the who's who of the literary world of that time, both north and south of the Vindhyas. The people who come from all over. The big contingent from Calcutta. The people from other parts of the country, not just Urdu writers. Yes, the engine leading the growth of this new fledgling movement are primarily English writers. They are Urdu writers. They are Urdu writers who are also very cosmopolitan. Many of them are bilingual, but they are primarily Urdu writers. But there are Hindi writers, Bangla writers. People from Odisha have come for this. This is undivided India, so people have come from Lahore and other places, cities from the Punjab. And the person who gives the presidential address is Premchand. He will die a few months later. He's this lion in winter. He's got this gravitas of a major writer. And he, in his presidential address, comes to address this very large gathering of young and old, known and relatively unknown writers. And he says some things which he comes with a prepared text, a written out text which he will read. And in that he says many things, but one of the things he says, which is simple and easy to understand, is he says we have to change the standard of beauty. हमें खूबसूरती का मयार बदलना होगा. Because the literature that was so far being produced, Premchand of course was writing very socially purposive, socially engaged literature, but we were still in India, at least in North India, pulling ourselves out of the thrall of the epics and the dastans. So he's saying that all this while we've had these moon maidens who are incredibly beautiful, we have these men who are heroic figures, and they occupy this sort of fantasy and fairy tale world of valor and beauty and heroism and so on. He says we have to pull ourselves out of the thrall of all this, and we have to find beauty in a woman who's working in the field. She has sweat on her brow. She's nursing a child that she has just given birth to, possibly in the fields, and she'll go back to working in the fields. We have to find beauty even in this, and we have to write even about this. So I'm not saying that no socially engaged literature is being written till this point. Of course it is, till 1936. Premchand himself has, so many others have. But he's telling the writers to not live in a cocoon, to not live in an island, but to write about whatever is in the world. That mirror that I alluded to earlier on. He's stressing the importance of literature being a mirror to society. So that is how the first Progressive Writers Association meeting happens. And almost simultaneously, centers are opening, branches are opening in almost all the big and small cities across undivided India. You have very active centers in Calcutta by centers I mean branches of the Progressive Writers Association in Patna, in Calcutta, in Lahore, in Aligarh, in Hyderabad, so on and so forth. And your city, Bombay, will emerge in the years ahead as the beating heart of the Progressive Writers movement, because people come from all over the country. Maybe we can talk about that later, but to answer your question, from 1936 onwards, there is a kind of almost frenzied speed with which this becomes a pan-Indian phenomena. And as I say, everybody is not a communist, so it's a misnomer to think that every progressive is a communist. But yes, they have a left of center worldview. They believe in all the big isms of that time, which is anti-colonialism, anti-fascism, anti-imperialism, feminism, land reform, and they say let's make common cause with all of these things. Yeah. So the writer is saying, Khwaja Ahmad Abbas writes an autobiography many years later and says, "I'm not an island." So that the idea behind "I'm not an island" is actually what the progressives are all about.
Yeah.
Anywhere, whether it's the naval mutiny off the shore of Mumbai, or it is the Tehbaga movement, or it is any movement anywhere in the country which is a people's movement. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or for that matter, the years ahead, the Great Bengal Famine.
Yeah.
IPTA is born out of that, which is a
Yeah.
sister concern of the Progressive Writers Association. So whether it's a man-made tragedy, or it is an uprising of any kind, or it is an expression of revolt, or it is mill workers going on strike, or it is teachers sitting on strike, anywhere in the country, the writer says that, listen, this too is of concern to me.
Yeah.
And why just in India, even abroad? And this is the time where India, of course, is the first to throw off the yoke of imperialism as the first of the Asian countries, but it's like a domino effect.
Yeah.
In Africa and Asia, countries are increasingly becoming independent.
Yeah.
So in the years ahead, the progressives will make common cause with all the newly emerging nations of Asia and Africa.
Yeah.
And they will write great poetry in support of either their leaders or their people or the people's aspirations. And they will forge these bonds of unity between writers in Asia, in Africa. So, Jafri Saab is Ali Sardar Jafri will say, about Africa, Jungle Jungle Phool Khila hai, and we'll talk about that. In the 60s, when this African leader is slain,
The Congolese Patrice Lumumba. Yeah.
Patrice Lumumba, when he's assassinated, the first democratically elected leader is assassinated. Our Indian progressives are writing in white heat.
Yeah.
And it makes us sad that we live in a time when a big tragedy happens, we say, oh, well, it happened abroad.
Yeah.
I mean, whether it's Gaza or the war that's happening, we think it's somebody else's war, it's somebody else's problem. And yet the progressives are making common cause with everybody else's misfortune. So this, when Patrice Lumumba is assassinated, Sahir writes something that we still quote. We forget its context, but we still quote these lines. Sahir says, "Khoon phir khoon hai, टपकेगा तो जम जाएगा, जुल्म आखिर जुल्म है, बढ़ता है तो मिट जाता है."
Yeah, but
so we forget the context, but the words remain with us. So I think these conversations that you and I are having, they're important because I think context is also important.
Yeah.
These were not written in isolation. These lines were written in a certain context. And I think we seem to be adrift on a sea of blithe heedlessness, that it's somebody else's, as we say in Delhi, in Punjabi, menu ki, So these were writers who did not believe in menu ki or tenu ki. They said that any tragedy can be ours. We can empathize. So the word empathy was very important for the progressives.
yeah, there was also, like what I read from your book and also from what the Mead brothers have written, is that there was this sort of global South solidarity that the writers really infused. It was also what the
Bandung conference happens, in Indonesia. There are people who are meeting all the time. I mean, now we meet on Lit Fests, which are sponsored events.
Yeah.
But these are people who go at their own expense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And this was even before independence and after independence. There's this, this Nehruvian idea of India and this idea of non-alignment leading the BRICS nations and all. But I want to talk about before independence. 1943 is the year that the first progressive meeting is held in Bombay in Marwadi Vidyalaya. And it's so cool because I start the walk there that I do for the progressives, and
take me on that walk next time.
I think you have to host it.
I will host it. I'll come along. I'll be the ghost who walks.
But then you should read, because I don't want to, my Urdu just offends myself also, it offends everybody. So I should not read. But it's really great to start there, because that part of town, it's still South Bombay, but it's on the other side of where the fort wall was. So while the fort has all of this Victorian Gothic architecture, this side, Marwadi Vidyalaya, Opera House, all the way to Bhindi Bazaar and all, it has a lot of what Mustansir Dalvi calls the domestic vernacular architecture. So you
Yeah.
really see it's built from migrant workers from Maharashtra, Gujarat, Muslim workers from different
Who
parts of
worked
the
in the mills. Many of them were factory workers.
Exactly. I really
And
want to talk
very
about that,
local
especially
that area.
Kefi
I did
Azmi
one.
and Narayan Surve's friendship, and even Comrade Shahira Mashik. But can you first tell us about the first ever Bombay meeting? And I also read the manifesto, which is available on Marxist.org online, and it's really fascinating. So, yeah, can you tell us about that?
Which manifesto are you referring to? The one that was adopted there in Bombay? Because the first one is the first manifesto, as it were, of the Progressive Writers Association was framed and adopted in the Calcutta session.
No, this is the Bombay session, the
Bombay session.
1943 one.
Okay, so changes are made. As with manifestos often happens, changes are made. And if I'm not mistaken, Comrade Dange comes to address this meeting, and he's a party man, and he makes it out like it's more an exercise in political economy rather than a literary treatise that is his paper. And later writers and later thinkers within the ideologues within the Progressive Writers Association have conceded that calling a party man such as Dange to come and deliver the presidential address at the Bombay session of the one that you're alluding to was maybe the undoing of the movement, as it were, because it should have been writers all along, such as Premchand was at the inaugural session. There was a lot of thinking about it in hindsight. But this meeting, the one that you're referring to, the Bombay session, is important also because it marks the birth of the IPTA, the Indian People's Theatre Association, in that very hall that you are referring to. And from 43 onwards, the progressive writers meetings, because the IPTA troops are there, they infuse these otherwise literary meetings with a lot of song and dance, because IPTA has its squads, again modeled on the Soviet example. But these squads they have Zora Sehgal, they were known as the Butt sisters, then Zora Butt and Uzma Butt, and the people who come from Ravi Shankar's Almora Institute and other places. And there was Prithviraj Kapoor. Also, just to go back a little in time, little before the conference that you are referring to, think of the Progressive Writers Association. Until the IPTA is born, there is the film industry. So think of them as these two interlocking circles. There are people who are members of the film industry, and there are people who are members of the Progressive Writers Association. And when the meetings happen in a Flagstaff House in Bombay, the film actors who come in and sit in. Prithviraj Kapoor is a regular at these meetings. This actor, Prem Dhawan's Prem Dhawan is the father. Anil Dhawan's father, Prem Dhawan, is also. So there are many people who work as lyricists, as script writers, dialogue writers. They're just on the fringes of the Bombay film industry, right? There could be light people, there could be struggling actors. Gulzar Saab talks about it in great detail, who's a very young man who's still finding his feet. He's very quiet, he's very shy. He says he just sits quietly. He says, मैं कभी मुंह नहीं खोलता था, मैं आके बस बैठता था in meetings में. कुछ meetings साहिर के घर में होती थी, कुछ अलग-अलग जगह. Designated place was this Flagstaff House where Kefi Saab and Sardar Jafri and others used to stay. And Banne Bhai was the kind of a, what shall I say, the Rue Ravan, the spirit of this whole caravan of who would keep these sort of young, unruly writers in check. He would be umpire when a fight broke out. He would be the attendance keeper. तुम पिछले संडे नहीं आए थे, and they would say, oh, sorry, मैं अपनी wife को film दिखाने ले गया था. So, and you get, I'm not making up these stories. You find these stories scattered in memoirs and autobiographies. And this one that I'm referring to is found in Shaukat Azmi's memoir. she says, we were newly married and we didn't want to go every Sunday to a literary meeting. Sometimes my husband and I wanted to go see a movie.
Yeah.
But then the next Sunday he would wag his finger and say, Tum pichle dafa nahi aaye the. So that was Banne Bhai, Sajjad Zahir. So this was and we get a luminous account of these meetings when they would travel outside, and Ismat Chughtai's memoirs and essays, memoirish essays, you should say. Their travelogues, their first person accounts, all kinds of things. So people talk about it. Javed Akhtar says that, he says, मैं तो पला बड़ा हूँ इसमें. I've grown up in the lap of the progressive movement. And this is corroborated by Ismat, who says Jadu, that is Javed Akhtar, and his brother, they were jumping up and down on the mattresses and they were creating havoc and they were running around. So we have so many cross references, people who went on to become eminent people, who were coming there as kids, whose parents were taking them along for these meetings, some in Bombay. Sometimes the Bombay progressives would travel as a group to other cities. So there's a beautiful, actually very funny account by Ismat Chughtai of this big group traveling by train with their kids and their pani ki botal and their khane ka hamper and everything. And she makes it sound like a big picnic or a jaunt, but actually it's a literary event.
Yeah.
So the stodginess of a literary gathering is missing because these are fun filled. There is a photograph that almost everybody who's interested in this movement has seen, I'm sure you have, of a picnic in Hanging Gardens. Yeah, there is a Bedi Saab, there's Manto's wife, there are so many people and they're just sitting on the lawns.
Also, Hanging Gardens is right near where Sajjad Zahir stayed, right? In Balkesh.
Yes. It's across the road from that commune where they all lived. So sometimes they would after the meetings or before the meetings. And then Sajjad Zahir had studied abroad. He was a man of the world. He was very cosmopolitan. He knew everybody. So let's say remember Bombay is a port and there are ships docking on their way to here and there, to Hong Kong or wherever. So Pearl Buck steps off the ship and is expected to be in Bombay, and he would sort of shepherd her to the PWA meeting and say, come and speak to our lot here. So that was often happening, regardless of ideology. I mean, I don't think you can consider Pearl Buck to be a progressive in the sense that these people were, but regardless of ideology, you have a bunch of very sort of eclectic people coming to address these. We have accounts of people who would, somebody has collated these meetings and he went away to Pakistan. It was published in a newspaper there in a serialized manner. So we have a first person account of these meetings. They were fun filled, they were occasionally acrimonious, there was a little bit of politics and tension, as it is with all literary organizations. But there is great literature being written in real time and being shared in real time. So somebody has just written a poem which years later will become some iconic poem. Is being read here. A story is being read here. You referred to Kafi Azmi, you referred earlier to these industrial hubs. There are these factories, not at the outskirts, but what is now Tony Bombay, which has been converted into cafes and other things. But there were factories right here. Now, Kafi Sahab and others would hold mushairas in these factories. Sometimes in the ones in Bombay, sometimes the ones outside, the outskirts of Bombay. Bhiwandi and places like that. Now, there would be these night-long either mushairas or night-long readings of short stories. We think of mushairas as the only verbal spaces where poetry is recited, but the progressives would have the long night of literature, which is a European concept really. I mean, the EU and others do the long night of literature, but the progressives were doing it right here in your Bombay and its outskirts. So in the evening, you would have an afsana, Shame Afsana or something they would call it, and a Christian Chandar would come and read his story, and then somebody else would come, and this would go on till the wee hours.
And Comrade Ibrahim at Awami Adara has told me that women would be active participants and they were there also all night.
You see, these were safe spaces for women. These were spaces that were inclusive. There were many women writers who were part of these gatherings. There were women who were part of the progressive movement from 1936, from the first very earliest meeting. Dr. Rashid Jahan, about whom I've written a whole book, Ismat, all the others, the two sisters, Khadija Masroor and Hajra Masroor, before they went away to Pakistan, they were in Bombay. They would sit in on these meetings, they would read their work. So, no, these were completely safe spaces for women. A lot of the writers' wives who were not writers, but they were in the fringes of literary activity, they would be working on radio or in a publishing company, or they would be editing a magazine. They would also come. So Sultana Jafri, who was Sardar Jafri's wife, would always be there. Shaukat Azmi, who's not a writer but a film actor, but very much part of the movement, as it were. She would be there in these meetings. So this was not just a cosmopolitan space, but I think it was a fairly gender just space. It was a space that did not have to create space for women in an artificial or forced manner. My sense is this was a space that was very organic, which seemed very natural and not forced in any way. Though of course we also have other voices like Rashid Jahan writing somewhere, and Sajjad Zahir mentions it in his own autobiography. In Roshnai, he says that Dr. Rashid Jahan would say, you men consider us worthy of nothing else except emptying ashtrays and filling out your teacups and maybe making stamps and putting stamps on envelopes. So there was a healthy sort of ribbing about it. You know?
Yeah.
So it was Rashid Jahan to call a spade and say, give us bona fide work. Don't give us this fringe work to do. So, but my sense is that overall these were healthy spaces, inclusive spaces.
What were the names of the sisters you talked about?
Khadija Masroor and Hajra Masroor.
Okay. Because
they were fiction writers, feminist fiction writers. Both went away, lived in Pakistan, but they spent some time in Bombay. And this high noon that I refer to, which is the 40s, just before partition, let's say from 43 to 47, or maybe early 40s. Remember that Pune was the hub of the film industry.
Yes.
Shalimar Studios and all those were in Pune.
Yeah.
So when the studios shifted to Bombay became a magnet for educated young men and young women to come to Bombay. Those who had studied, Manto and others who'd come from Aligarh. Manto never finished his graduation, but Shahid Latif, Ismat Chugta, his husband, for example, Ismat herself had studied at Aligarh. So Bombay became a magnet for all these people. Urdu is still the lingua franca, remember that. The Bombay film industry is still, we call it the Hindi film industry, but the people who were writing the script, the dialogue, the scenes, the script, the films, the lyrics were largely in Hindustani, we can say, but primarily with a great deal of Urdu vocabulary in it. So this mass of young men and women who knew Urdu could be absorbed in different ways in not just the film industry, but remember the People's Publishing House opened shop, the left-leaning publishing company in Bombay, in Karachi also. And so there were a whole lot of peripheral activities. Film magazines. Manto was working in a film magazine. He came to work in a film magazine after all. So, and many of them were in Urdu. Isn't there this lovely OTT series, with the, I'm trying to remember his name, but it actually recaptures this time. It'll come to me. It has Aditi Rao Haidari, and it's about a studio owner and his wife, and these people who've come from Mufassil towns and smaller areas and come to Bombay, and how they make a career. It'll come to me in a minute. Anyhow, so and that in that sense, that OTT is that series is very close to reality. That there are all these young men and women. So as I say, they work in publishing, they work in periodicals and magazines. Again, those periodicals and magazines could be feeding the film industry. They could be like about film actors, their lives, or new film launches, or news about the film industry. Or they could be what were called popular digests, like Reader's Digest, the equivalent of that. So this is a time which is seeing a mushrooming of the Urdu periodicals. And the digest is a form that it has something for everybody. So there'd be a recipe, there'd be a profile, there'd be a short story. And people like Krishan Chandra were writing for these magazines also, He was bridging that big divide between serious writing and popular writing. So Krishan Chandra was in that sense both. So you have all of these periodicals, magazines, film magazines, the film industry itself that is providing opportunity. And let's not forget the newspapers. A great many Urdu newspapers are coming out from here. Niaz Haidari and others are on the fringes of this whole journalistic world. And these are fluid spaces. So you hop from a newspaper office and you come for a PWA meeting, and then you hop for an IPTA meeting, and then you go somewhere else. So but from 43 onwards, once the IPTA is created, you have the two concentric circles, the film industry and the PWA has become three concentric circles. You have IPTA, you have the film industry, and you have the progressives meeting. And another thing I want to say is that people are not working in silos of languages. So it's not as though the Urdu walas will only. So living in Bombay, they will invite a Marathi speaker, a Gujarati speaker. And again, these documents that we have of the meetings will give you names and dates and all the details. Mama Warirkar, the Marathi writer, various Gujarati writers. I don't have the names in my head right now, but we have documentary evidence of all of these people being invited to the PWA meetings, and they in turn would invite the Urdu progressives to their meetings. So in Bombay at least, the Gujarati PWA, the Marathi PWA, the Hindi PWA, the Urdu PWA would meet very freely and frequently. May I also just recount this anecdote that was told to me by Gulzar Saab. Gulzar Saab is still not known in the industry. He's not written his famous song Mohi Sham Rang De De. He's not this name, but he's interested in books. He's been an avid reader all his life. He quietly sits in on these meetings. He lives in one of the outhouses of Sahil Ludhianvi. He sees all these big people come and go. And he tells me that the Bombay trams, which I have not seen them, maybe you have seen them or maybe you've seen pictures, the trams of Bombay had a rounded rear portion. And so the progressives couldn't always afford a meeting space. Sometimes when they wanted to hold a meeting, they would get onto one of these trams, with a ticket of course, and they would go and hang out at the back, at the rear of the tram. And so they would go till wherever the tram was going, and then all the way back while having their meeting at the rear of the tram, right? So, I mean, there were innovative ways of meeting, of sharing work, and there was a great deal of fellowship. There was a great deal of sharing of work in progress. आपने ताज़ा ग़ज़ल लिखी है, and as a poet, you want to recite it, you want to share it with a sorority of writers. So these things gave you the opportunity to do that.
Just speaking of the thriving ecosystem, the multilingual ecosystem, I was speaking to Zubair Azmi Saab, who runs Urdu Markaz Library in Madanpura, and he recently did an event for Kafi Azmi, and Shabana was there and everything. So I spoke to him, and he said that because Madanpura is a working class neighborhood, Kafi Azmi and Narayan Surve, the very famous Marathi textile mills activist and poet, they used to take walks together in that neighborhood. I read also in Jerry Pinto's translations of Survey that in 1974, both of them were in the same flight to the Soviet Union. I have read about how that was one connection, and also I went to the Mumbai Marathi Grantha Sangralaya to look at the little magazines of Marathi, and in the 1950s magazine, it's a fully Marathi magazine, and in that there was a translation of one of Sahir's poems. So there's this very active, there's this awareness that there were different poets living in proximity of one another. And also then, since some of the Urdu poets were in the Communist Party, so was Shahir Amar Sheikh, who was very important to like the Samyukta Maharashtra movement and to Marathi poetry. So there were so many connections that I'm noticing.
That is
Even the
cross-cultural
areas,
identity.
yeah, even the areas that I do the crawls in. For instance, the Urdu crawl starts in Marwari Vidyalayar and goes towards Madanpura. A parallel road from Madanpura, from Sarvis, goes into Kamathipura, which is where the Marathi poet Namdev Dhasal lived, and which is where like Prajna Daya Pawar has written about.
And so many of Manto's stories are Forest Road and all those places.
Exactly. And then there's also Shepherd Road, which is where Nissim Ezekiel lived very briefly in a house called Retreat because there was a big Jewish community over there. So, I mean, it's crazy to see all of these ecosystems. But I want to ask you how much of it was actually hinged upon politics? Like, what was the role of the CPI in Urdu poetry in particular?
I would say, Saranya, the glue that held these people together was nationalism and this abiding desire to see the country become independent. Which is why you see the movement petering out, you see people sort of going their separate ways, some people saying our objective has been achieved, others taking the party line and saying no, this is not the affairs writes his famous lament, ye daag daag ujala, ye shab gazida seher, ye wo seher to nahi tha intezar jiska. This is not the dawn that we were waiting for. That's the party line.
Yeah.
But those who are not within the party, those who are fellow travelers, say our objective has been achieved. Now let us get on with the business of nation building. Again, this finds expression in the film industry and the songs. If you recall, there's this song, Chodo kal ki baatein, kal ki baat purani, aao milkar likhein nayi kahani. This is a progressive song.
You also have written about the Naya Daur song, Saathi Haath Badhao.
Saathi Haath Badhao, all picturized on dams and construction sites. At one level, this is a very Soviet model that is being replicated. But remember, we are influenced by the Soviet model. Our 5-year plans, our unemployment, wanting to check corruption, wanting to check black marketing. These are all, many things have been learnt and adapted from the Soviet model. And the film industry, the lyricists, the dialogue writers, the producers, they're all interpreting it in different ways. Nehru is going to officially say it much later at the inauguration of the Bhakra Nangal Dam. He will say that let the temples of modern India be its schools and its colleges and its factories and its dams. But that is a statement he's making from that public space. But Nehruvian India is saying that we must get on with the business of nation building. Let us put our shoulder to the wheel, and every man should be at the job of getting on with building this nation. And the film industry has a great role to play in disseminating this message. Remember, this is a time when the Hindi songs play on radios and transistors from every chai ki dukaan, every pan ki dukaan. And the song that is played on All India Radio is north and south of the Vindhyas. It goes into the crevices of the popular imagination, it seeps through the cracks and it reaches where written word does not. Books and periodicals and newspapers do not have the reach that the film song of that period has. And so I would say that the film industry is being very responsive and mindful in Bombay, the Hindi film industry as we say, but with a great many Urdu writers in it. The kind of songs that they are churning out, the kind of films that they are making, they are all interpreting this idea that, kal ki baat chodo, jo acha bura jo bhi hua. They don't want to go into was partition right or wrong, but they're saying let's learn lessons, let's tell ourselves that we will never repeat the wrongs of the partition years, that we will never indulge in communal violence. It's a different matter that those lessons are forgotten a few decades later, and communal violence never quite entirely goes away from our lives even after Gandhiji's assassination. So but nevertheless, the film industry and the Urdu writer, especially those associated with the progressive writers movement, are constantly saying, let's learn our lessons. Abhi bhi waqt hai, abhi bhi time hai. We can still, make something of ourselves. And whether there are these people's mushairas in Bhiwandi and other places, whether there are these popular digests and popular magazines. And here I'm talking of the years after 47.
Mm.
Urdu will gradually shrink in importance, but it doesn't disappear overnight.
Yeah.
For another 10, 15 years, even the PWA is much reduced in strength. The influence is shrinking day by day. But it's not an overnight phenomena. It has about 15 odd years after independence where it's still a force to reckon with, where it still has a popular appeal, and it is making the most of its strengths to draw people's attention to shunning communalism, to living in harmony, to building something with their lives. You have these Kavi Pradeeps and others, again, not progressive in the way, hardcore way we understand progressivism, but every time there's a war, Kavi Pradeep says, the wars that we have with China and the wars that we have with Pakistan in the years ahead. Kavi Pradeep is writing this very patriotic, not jingoistic, but really patriotic poetry. And there are lessons to be learned with the kind of jingoistic nationalistic films that are being made now, where you demonize and other one community in order to valorize a community. These 15, 20 years after partition, there is no demonizing. The writer, the poet, everybody is saying that, we've got to make something of our lives. We've got to put the shattered past behind us. And I think the role of the Urdu writer in these years is very, very crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that it's really tragic that I don't get to see in the current day and age. Before we talk about sort of the decline of the movement, I also want to ask about what were the different I never really understand labels like modernist and postmodernist, but what were the different genres, let's say, of Urdu poetry in Bombay? Because there's, for instance, Meena Kumari right here on this Kohinoor poster, who was also a shaira. There was Nida Fazli, who was writing, I've read different kind of poetics to the progressives. And as the 60s came by, you had this new generation of Urdu poets in Bombay. Would you see a sort of generational change from the progressives, and what kinds were they?
Yes, the high noon of the progressive writers movement has a very sudden steep decline, which coincides with the rise of another movement called the Jadidiyat, which means modernism. And you might think that modernism and progressivism are coming from the same place. Actually, in the Urdu lexicon, they occupy opposite ends of the literary spectrum. So you have the progressives on the left, and you have the Jadid Parast. I won't say on the right, but they are certainly not on the left. Insofar as they say they want to write poetry which has personal, whimsical, even idiosyncratic symbols and images. Some that they coin, some that they adopt from the classical tradition. I mean, the Chand, the Sitara, the Badal has always existed. But the way the modernists are giving it a spin, as it were, they become deeply personal. For the progressives, nothing is personal. The personal is the political, right? But for the modernists, the personal is deeply personal. And the modernists are saying, Mera dukh, mera gham, mera sense of dislocation, mera angst, मेरे लिए मायने रखता है, आपके लिए नहीं रखता, that's your problem, but it is important to me. And there is, there's a sense of dislocation with youth leaving their homes in the qasbas and the small towns and coming to big cities, not just Bombay, but Delhi, which is the political capital of India, to Calcutta, to other cities, So this youth that has left its roots in the hinterland and come to big cosmopolitan cities feels a sense of angst. I mean, what is all these Nida Fazli songs that were being picked up for the Amol Palekar kind of films that were being made, of course much later, but it talks Gharonda and other things. So there is a sense of how do I put it without sounding like I'm making a value judgment, but essentially the modernists are saying that, listen, I am concerned with my sense of sorrow,
Yeah.
sadness, whatever I'm feeling. And I'm going to write poetry about that. Nationalism वगैरह ठीक है बहुत हो गया, but I want to talk about what my feelings are. And this is anathema to the progressives who are saying, no, you've got to talk about, you've got to make common cause. It's selfish to talk about just yourself. The modernists are inspired by the French symbolists. You have people like Muhammad Hassan Askari who have read a great deal of French symbolism, and they are saying that the symbols are important, and it's okay if those symbols are opaque.
Yeah.
Yeah, they don't, meaning doesn't have to be instantly communicable. All this while the progressives have said communication is all. These people come along and they say, and this is a literary debate, I mean it's of course a political debate also, but it's essentially to answer your question, when the progressives begin their decline, that is when the jadidiyat is, as it were, becoming a force to reckon with. And by the 60s, you will have poets like Shahryar, who writes his first Isme Azam, his first collection of poetry as a very young man in Aligarh, who will also come to the Bombay film industry, but he will keep going back to Aligarh. He'll come to write a song or two for Gaman or Nomrao Jan, but he'll always go back to his teaching job and his roots in Aligarh. So you have people like Shahryar who are occupying that intersection of progressivism and Jadid Parasti. And he will write poems that take from both traditions in a very healthy way. One short poem that I remember, शहरयार्स नज़्म, ये जो आसमां पे सितारा है, इसे अपनी आँख से देख लो, इसे अपने हाथ से छू लो, इसे अपने होंठ से चूम लो, कि इसी पे हमला है रात का. Yeah. Now, Asman, Sitara, Chand, these are all things that we have had in Urdu poetry forever and ever. Yeah. Now, what are these dark forces? ये कौन सा हमला है कि आसमान पे जो एक सितारा है जिसको पोएट कह रहा है देख लो, give it validity by touching it, by seeing it, huh? By kissing it, because then you give it a validity, you validate its existence. What are these things? He's not telling you what those are. They could be dark political forces, they could be malevolent personal forces. It's up to you. Yeah. So there's an openness to the modernist movement, or those who draw from both sources, who drink from both wells, who occupy both streams, as it were. But the hardcore modernists say, Shamsur Rahman Farooqi brings out a journal from Shapkhun from Allahabad, and he is, as it were, the Mire Karwan of the modernists in India, and he says it's okay if communication is a casualty. It's all right. The important thing is for you to express your feelings.
Yeah.
So we have a movement which is very different from the progressive movement, which is gaining ground, which is finding currency, in very many ways. Neeraj, who comes from Aligarh to write for films, writes this lovely sort of elegy, Karwan Guzar Gaya, Hum Ghubar Dekhte Rahe. These are self-indulgent in a way. I mean, I'm sorry, self-indulgent is maybe not the right word, but they talk about self without any self-consciousness about one's own despair.
Yeah.
Progressives thought despair is unhealthy. You've got to be hopeful at all times. You've got to look forward. You can't be nostalgist. You can't look back. You've got to look ahead. Now, along comes these people, the modernists, who say it's okay to be despairing.
Yeah.
And then a few years later in films, you'll have The Angry Young Man, produced by Javed Akhtar and Salim Khan, who's also coming from the same place of despair and angst and dislocation of young men who are completely broken-hearted by the corruption, the lack of employment opportunities. They're angry with the system.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the progressives have an anger, but they have an anger towards caste hierarchies, towards Samaj.
Yeah.
But they are hopeful that we are going to break these and we'll create a new samaj. But when that change doesn't happen, or that change doesn't happen commensurate with the kind of speed that people had wanted,
Yeah.
it gives rise to a despair.
Yeah, which is also seen. I'd like to see in the different in the generation between Jan Nisar Akhtar and Javed Akhtar's poetry. Just reading both of them, "Awaaz Do Hum Ek Hai," and then you have Javed Akhtar Sahab who's writing about the individual, the alienation of the individual, this sense of moral apathy in relation to these large structures that one cannot change. And I do recognize that this was, pre-nation and post-nation building. Which brings me to my last question, really, which is I'm so fascinated in your book about how you write about the disillusionment with this nation state, with what happened. And I see this sense of like almost personal heartbreak in the later parts of some of the progressives' writings. And so I want to ask you just about the progressive movement in the latter half of the 20th century, as well as the development of the idea of the nation that they had.
I think none better than Sahir to very briefly. There's so many others, but just to answer your question as briefly as I can, Sahir's poetry contains a lot. Akhtarul Iman also, many others who were progressives, who believed in the idea of a socially just society. And this begins very early on in the life of the new nation. By the time the first 15 August comes along, it's been a year to the new nation, new republic. Uh, um, um, uh, we have a bunch of poems entitled 15 August.
Yeah.
And people are giving, I've written about these in various essays studied here and there in different anthologies, but I've written about this disenchantment that you're talking about. People are saying, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm not quoting exactly, but poets are saying, ये वो लड़ाई नहीं थी जो हमने लड़ी थी, ये वो सुबह नहीं थी जिसका हमने इंतजार किया था, उन काली सदियों को जो हमने अपने सर पे से उठा के एक चादर की तरह फेंका था, तो वो इस सुबह के लिए नहीं फेंका था, इस सूरज के लिए नहीं फेंका था, you know. So I think the people are dismayed by the black marketing, by the social engineering that is not happening at the pace that people wanted. The communal ill will, which people thought it's a plant that has been weeded out and thrown away and people are going to learn lessons, but that communal ill will was never weeded out entirely, right? I mean, we live in a post-truth times where it's there, it's born a very ugly fruit which is there for everybody to see. But in the early years, there's a lot of dismay and sort of people are sick at heart about this. The lingering, as it were, the consequences of the partition that are unspooling, and people take different ways. So you have a Mahinder Kapoor writing, you have various people writing either tongue-in-cheek, in satirical ways, in humorous ways, in bitter ways, in sharply critical ways. So the Urdu fiction writer and the poet, the memoirist also, the diary writer also, the Urdu journalist also, in different ways is interpreting this sense of course there's joy also. Let me not for a minute think that all of the Urdu period poetry and fiction, Urdu literature in the years after 47 is dark. No, it isn't. Those strands are there, but there's a lot of hope and joyousness and, looking forward, and as I said, asking people to put the past behind them. So Urdu literature has never been cut from the same cloth. You can't say this is the dominant theme. There are several dominant themes at any given time. So for every naysayer, there's somebody saying, no, this is, we must look forward, this is Azadi, this is not just Batwara, this is Azadi, and we have to make the most of what we have, the hand that we have been dealt. Yes, we have a truncated country, but then we have so much going for us, and so on and so forth. So there are multiple voices.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Jalil. And just to conclude, any thoughts on how we can recognize the importance of the progressives in this day and age, in this very bleak saffron 2026 day and age? Because I do think that so many of their voices are echoed today and are so important. But do you see their presence around?
I see their presence around. I did my master's in English, and it was like I knew more daffodils and Keats and Wordsworth and all of that. But I see curriculum changing. I see young people doing a master's or even a graduation in English, not just reading Anglo-Saxon writers. They read a Manto and they read a Kamala Markanday and they read a Rashid Jahan and so on and so forth. So I see syllabus changing. So I see hope. Um, I think there are some of the more forward-thinking universities are offering fundamental courses across disciplines, which means a science student must also know something about Indian literature in its broadest, widest sense. So yeah, some names are not just the Premchand that we encountered in Do Bailon Ki Katha in Hindi textbooks in school, but I think these foundational courses are creating space for our masters from the Bhashas, and in that I think lies hope. They can at best open a window. It's
Yeah.
up to you. It's up to the student to do what they will with that window that has been opened for you. So if you've read a Manto story, go looking for more Manto stories. If you've read a little fraction of a Christian Chandra or a Bedi or somebody, cinema. I'll come back to cinema. Cinema has done such yeoman service for literature. So many of Bedi's stories, so many of Christian Chandra's stories have been turned into films as not just serials for Doordarshan back in the day, but mainstream cinema. So yeah, but the context is sometimes forgotten. We started with this, and we'll come back to that. My one sort of a word of advice. I hate to use the word advice, but my suggestion would be that people be more mindful of context. Why was a certain thing written? In which time, which era? What were the circumstances? Who was the writer? So let's not just read a piece of writing, fiction, non-fiction, poetry, whatever, uh, without being mindful of its context.
Yeah.
Because there are lessons not just in the text, but in the context as well.
Absolutely. On that note, thank you so much.
Thank you. Pleasure talking to you,
You.
Saranya.